Even though the breakup of the Beatles is one of the most debated topics about the band, everyone seems to agree that 1968 was the year that broke them. Which is quite ironic because this was the year they released the best album of their discography, and quite frankly, of all time, the White Album. The album's experimentation, its massive size, and variety of genres guarantee a unique experience, but another thing that makes this album such an interesting piece is how isolated and broken the band sounds, especially when it comes to Paul McCartney. If you follow this channel, then you probably know that the White Album is my favorite album of all time. For a variety of reasons, I love the experimentation of the album, I love how weird and quirky a lot of the songs are, I love how important it was for the evolution of the band as songwriters, I love how it showed the dissolution of the band while they were still together. But most importantly, I think that a lot of you will understand when I say that this album has this aura of mystery and darkness and isolation that surrounds it and makes each listen really interesting, and that aura seems to be present the most when we're listening to the Paul McCartney compositions, at least in my opinion, which is why I wanted to make this video. When I heard this album for the first time, I was maybe 14, 13 years old. My dad bought it for me, and honestly, I had an epiphany. I loved every minute of it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't even be making videos if it weren't for the White Album, because ever since, I've been trying to find more and more music that makes me feel even close to how I felt with the White Album. And it's kind of weird for me to like this album so much, especially if you know about the whole story of what happened in India, the recording sessions, you know how Geoff Emerick, the band's sound engineer and one of the greatest sound engineers that music ever saw, left the band during a recording session because of how aggressive John Lennon was being. You have John Lennon going through a really heavy heroin addiction and bringing Yoko into the studio, making the whole atmosphere even more awkward. You have Ringo leaving the band because of this same tensions inside the band. You have George Harrison complaining even more about his songs being ignored and having to wait 2 months to record While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which is funny because it's one of the best songs in the album. And of course you have good old Paul being more and more controlling, trying to tell Ringo how he's supposed to play the drums. Basically, a lot of bad things were happening, which wasn't usually the case when you explore the nature of the band's relationship in albums like Sgt. Pepper, Revolver, Rubber Soul, and even more if you go to the Beatlemania albums. There was always this peaceful and friendly environment. Obviously they had their disagreements, especially when it comes to George Harrison and Paul McCartney, but it was always on a friendlier tone, and Paul McCartney was always the one who was the most invested in the George Harrison songs, especially in albums like Rubber Soul, with tracks like If I Needed Someone and Think for Yourself. There's a number of reasons why this happened. You have the death of Brian Epstein in 1967, their trip to India, the creation of Apple in January of 1968, an attempt from the Beatles to kind of manage themselves, but it was a big problem because it made them go from a creative partnership to a business partners, and when money gets in the way of music, man, it always ends badly. Thanks to the words of a certain inventor called Alexi Smartass, also known as Magic Alex, the Beatles were not happy with the technology that was featured on the studio, so they were constantly complaining to sound engineer Geoff Emerick and the band's producer George Martin.
Hello, I'm Alexis from Apple Electronics. I would like to say hello to all my brothers around the world, and to all the girls around the world, and to all the electronic people around the world.
But he didn't do anything. When we finally got him to do a recording studio, we had a 16-track studio, and we walked in there, it was chaos. We had to rip it all out and start again. He had like 16 little speakers all around the room.
In other words, this wasn't the same band anymore. This weren't the Beatles that invaded America in 1964. It was a completely different band, and actually, in my opinion, it wasn't even a band. And the reason for that lies in their trip to India. Now, please don't get me wrong, I personally believe that their trip to India was incredibly productive, and it resulted in some of my favorite songs by the band. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Blackbird, Dear Prudence, Obla-Di Obla-Da, Helter Skelter, Your Blues, you have some incredible music being written around this time, but they were written in a different way. Before their trip to India, almost every single song they wrote was shared with the rest of the group, they gave their input and the song changed. It evolved into something different. It went from a John Lennon or a Paul McCartney or a George Harrison song to a Beatles song. You can see that in the takes and demos of a lot of the songs from the Sgt. Pepper album and the Revolver album. The songs were very different from their original takes or original demos, and that doesn't really happen in the White Album. If anything, the demos sound like unplugged versions of the songs. They're barely even different, and part of the reason for this is that they didn't really share their compositions with each other until it was time to record them. And even though every single band member did this, you have George Harrison with the more acoustic version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. You have John Lennon with songs like Julia, but when it comes to Paul McCartney, you have quite a few more. Mother Nature's Son, Blackbird, Rocky Raccoon, Honey Pie, I Will, songs that barely even need any of the other Beatles. Actually, if you were to tell me they belong to a solo Paul McCartney album, I would believe you in a minute. And even the songs that do require some help from the band, like Helter Skelter, Back in the USSR, and Up La Dia Bla Da, Paul McCartney is the main contributor, when in the past, he always liked to involve the rest of the band, as you can see in songs like Getting Better, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band title track, and so on and so forth. This was nothing new from McCartney. When you go to albums like Help, you have Yesterday and I've Just Seen a Face. When you go to albums like Rubber Soul, you have Michelle. When you go to albums like Revolver, you have For No One. When you go to Sgt. Pepper, you have She's Leaving Home, When I'm 64. Songs that don't really need the rest of the Beatles. But in this album, it seems like he was so eager to work by himself, to use the rest of the band as session musicians rather than, part of the group. And a lot of people like to say that that's just the formula of the Beatles. Even Paul McCartney himself has said multiple times that whoever wrote the song gets to decide what's going to be done with the song.
Rule in the Beatles was if it was your song, you were allowed to call it.
I was going to ask you
You were the
that.
boss of the song.
Because someone's got to be the boss.
Yeah.
And I get it, I really do, but I feel like in previous albums, Paul was way more open to, receiving ideas from his bandmates. Instead, when you explore the whole track list of the White Album, I'm pretty sure you'll find that the only real contribution that any of the other band members provided for his songs and made it to the final cut was the opening riff on the Up La Dia Bla Da tune. When you compare the demos to the final cuts, they sound almost exactly the same. There's barely any change, and if there's any change, it was probably, suggested by Paul himself. Now, of course, this idea that Paul McCartney was alone in the White Album doesn't only come from listening to the album or exploring the story of the recording sessions. It also comes from a lot of the things he said, while narrating the story of how he wrote a lot of the songs that were included in here. I've been reading this book. My sister gave it to me about 4 months ago, I think, 5 months ago. I've been loving it. I personally recommend, if you're a fan of Paul McCartney, you should definitely give it a try. You'll probably find a lot of books like these out there, but the reason why I like this one so much is mainly because, unlike others I've read, I think he doesn't get all that technical. He doesn't really talk too much about chords and so on and so forth. He mainly focuses on telling the story of what inspired the song and how the idea transformed into the songs we all love and, we all listen to very often. And something I noticed while reading this book is how different the process of putting pen to paper was when it comes to the songs from the White Album. A vast majority of them, at least. When you go to any other album, any other songs written in albums like Abbey Road and Let It Be, which were albums that, where the band's relationship wasn't necessarily the greatest either, you'll find that even in those, Paul liked to involve his bandmates in the writing process. Instead, in a lot of the songs from the White Album, the idea began with Paul McCartney and ended with Paul McCartney. But I personally believe that a really important question would be, is this Paul McCartney's fault? Was he being selfish or was he being misunderstood? Well, personally, I think it was the latter. One of the most popular examples of a disagreement with his bandmates happened with George Harrison, unsurprisingly. While recording the song Hey Jude, George had the amazing idea of echoing McCartney's vocals with his guitar. Now, I invite you to imagine the song Hey Jude, one of the greatest songs of all time, one of the most recognizable tunes in the history of music, and then imagine a guitar being played every time that Paul McCartney says a line. Let's agree that it wasn't a great idea. Paul was really happy with the way Hey Jude sounded, so he rejected the idea from George, and George got really angry.
It's like, should we play guitar all through Hey Jude? Well, I don't think we should.
Yeah, okay, well, I don't mind. I'll play, whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that would please you, I'll do it.
And by the way, the video I just showed you was from the Get Back sessions, January of 1969, 6 or 7 months after the recording of the White Album, which means that George was so annoyed about the whole Hey Jude situation that as soon as Paul brought it up, he went complete defense mode. And if you think that George was a little passive-aggressive in that video, then you should take a look at some of the comments that John was making around this time about Paul's music. Almost every single song that Paul brought to the studio was labeled as granny music, and he said that about songs like Martha My Dear, Honey Pie, I Will. I think that Obla Di Obla Da also fits that category for him. Actually, you know that little guitar solo towards the end of Honey Pie? Well, that was John trying to make the song more interesting because, according to him, the song was boring and it was only another one of Paul's granny music compositions. So yeah, he wasn't being that friendly, and the music that he was making was very different from anything that Paul wanted to do. Still, Paul was really invested in almost every single one of the songs that John penned for this album, like Dear Prudence, Glass Onion, Happiness is a Warm Gun. His backing vocals are found in almost every single John Lennon composition, but when it comes to Paul, that's not the case at all. Now, we don't really know why this happened. We don't really know if Paul didn't really want the help of any of his bandmates, or we don't know if they didn't really want to help him because they weren't that invested in his compositions, which might have been the case considered how different the songs that George and John were writing compared to the songs that Paul was writing around this time. But at the end of the day, once again, I just don't have any evidence. When I listen to this album, I just feel like Paul is so lonely. You know, if you were to tell me that a vast majority of the songs in this album, like Martha My Dear, like Blackbird, like I Will, like Mother Nature's Son, like Honey Pie, you know, some of my favorite songs on the record, by the way, belong to his solo discography, not really to any of the Beatles albums, then I will tell you that you're right, because it doesn't really feel like the band was invested or was participating in any of these compositions. Not really, you know, when it comes to the personnel that's listed, you know, the official information we have, all 4 Beatles are listed in a majority of the songs in here. There's a few exceptions, of course, like the song Back in the USSR, where Paul McCartney plays the drums because Ringo had left the studio, once again because of the tension, and you have the song Blackbird that only features pulling the guitar and his foot tapping. Another examples would be the song Mother Nature's Son. Even though the song does have percussion, apparently, according to the personnel listed, Ringo had nothing to do with it. Then you go to Helter Skelter, a song that obviously involves the rest of the band as well, but the lead guitar, the lead bass, and the lead vocals belong to Paul McCartney, are credited to Paul McCartney. George Harrison participated in the lead and rhythm guitar as well, but the one who you can hear the most in the in the mix is Paul McCartney's guitar playing, not George Harrison's. Martha My Dear could be another example. I'm not really sure. Depending on the source, some say that Paul was the one who played the drums, and some others say that it was Ringo, like the liner notes from the 2018 mix of the album, so I'm not really sure. Based on how the drumming sounds, I think it was Paul, but you know, if the liner notes from the official release of the album say that that Ringo was the drummer, then I guess I have to go with that. And when it comes to the guitar playing, even though some sources claim that George added some overdubs towards the end of the day, most of the guitar playing you hear in that song comes from Paul. So even when you look at the personnel, it's pretty much clear that he was basically alone during the recording sessions of this album. And once again, I don't really see this as a bad thing, you know. I actually think it's amazing that Paul, George, and Ringo were able to grow that much as solo artists while still making a Beatles record. And once again, the White Album is my favorite album of all time, so clearly, even though the band members sound so isolated from each other, I personally believe that's the reason this album feels like such a creative juggernaut with so many different styles and sound palettes. I personally love it. I do believe that this is the album that broke the Beatles. I do think that this barely even counts as a release by the Beatles. For me, this is 4 different solo releases or solo efforts packed into a single album, and you know, with the Beatles name slapped into it. But I don't really see that as a bad thing, you know. It's like having a prelude of what their solo discographies were going to sound like, you know. In my opinion, every single George Harrison song in this album could have been on All Things Must Pass. Almost every single John Lennon song in this album could have been on Plastic Ono Band or Imagine. And actually, some of the songs written around this time, like Child of Nature, for example, evolved into the song Jealous Guy in Imagine. But especially when it comes to Paul McCartney, I believe that any of the songs that he provided for this album could have been in any of his solo albums from the 70s, and actually maybe even some of his releases with Wings, because he didn't only write the songs in complete isolation, he also recorded not only the vocals but also the instrumentation of a lot of these songs in complete isolation as well. He was clearly there for his bandmates in their songs, you know. Don't believe me, just look at the personnel. You'll find him in the backing vocals, in the drumming, in the bass playing, in the piano, in the rhythm guitar, and almost every single element of the instrumentation. But when it comes to his songs, what I find is that most of the time, Paul was doing most of the work by himself. Now, knowing Paul, maybe that's what he wanted. Maybe he was being selfish. Maybe he felt like he didn't need the rest of the band. Or maybe simply the rest of the band wasn't really that invested in his music. But whatever the case might be, every time that I listen to the White Album, I can't shake the feeling that Paul sounds very lonely. And I know that around this time, the band was crumbling apart. I know that the recording sessions were a nightmare for all of the band members and everyone felt isolated. But especially when it comes to Paul McCartney, I believe believe that it's undeniable that he sounds completely and utterly alone in almost every single one of his songs in the White Album.
Paul, about a year and a half ago, there were quotes on The Wire about your discussion of LSD and some other things, narcotics.
Yes, Larry.
It seemed to me from what I read that you had endorsed it and condemned it.
We were manufacturing it.
What's the story?
No, the business went bump.
And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well. I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.